as a beginning question, it's really just that. How do you think about artificial intelligence? Maybe what is the artificial? What would you contrast the artificial with? Can we begin there?
I think it's more the question about intelligence, to be honest. I mean, it's definitely artificial. So I think there are several things, and we're actually about to announce a major action research program on this, possibly this week, but certainly next week, where we're looking at two things. One is the type of decisions you make as an organization, and that includes micro decisions at the front line as well as macro strategic decisions. And in those decisions, look at the balance between abductive and inductive reasoning. Now, I probably need to explain that, but it's key. Right? So inductive reasoning is kind of like inference from previous examples. Deductive is if A then B, inductive is all the cases of A have B, so I assume some probability basis it will happen the same way. That's actually how current LLMs work. And then there's abductive reasoning, which is human. Which is definitely linked to the role of aesthetics in human development. And whether art came before language or the other way around is slightly controversial. I go with the art came first school. But basically what aesthetics does is it distances you from the material, so you see novel connections between things. And that allows us to work without training data sets, whereas LLMs need training data sets. So the abductive inductive reasoning one is a key principle, right, in terms of the way things work. And by the way, human beings are not very good at inductive. So if you look at some of the tests, for example, there was a major study published on one of the big consultancy firms which show how much more productive they were using AI, or rather more specifically LLM, and I'll make that distinction in a second. And to me, that just proved how bad consultancy has become, because all they're doing is synthesizing existing text. And AI will probably do that better, and they're less concerned about the truth. So I think that's one factor. The other factor we're going to look at on the research program is what jobs you need to do in order, which AI can actually do better. But if you don't do them as a human being, you don't develop high capacity anyway. And so that's going to be a program. We want to create an audit tool that will run over 6 months to January next year. And part of the reason for that is the danger from AI is not that it will exceed humans in intelligence, but the human beings will dumb themselves down to the point where AI will outperform. And this is epigenetics. We can lose capacity quite quickly. So if you look at the studies coming out on cognitive decline, we all thought AI would produce cognitive decline. None of us thought it would happen that quickly. If you look at Apple's, and this is another issue, by the way, there's so much money involved in AI, you can't trust any of the research. So people dismiss Apple because they say Apple are falling behind in AI. I actually think they're having the sense to wait and see. They're not caught up in the hype curve. But their research demonstrated that AI doesn't work when tasks get very complex. Also, LLMs are training themselves off the internet. Well, I think 30-40% of the internet is now AI generated, or it's some very high figure. And if a model feeds off itself, it's got a real problem. So I think there's a whole series of issues there. I call it artificial inference, not artificial intelligence. I think the other thing is we're neglecting things like neural networks, although they are used in LLMs, but we're neglecting other forms of AI which are less energy destructive. And it's no coincidence that the human brain uses a fairly limited number of megabots, and it can outperform LLMs in many functions. Right, where they use vast resources the planet hasn't got. So what happens when the electricity breaks? Because it will. So I think there are significant issues on that, and it's not the sort of we've always objected to progress, so the horse is objected to the car, etc. This is far more substantial. This is a phase shift, right? And the danger is it also defines human intelligence as the ability to process information in text form. And that itself is a highly limited definition. We took a group on a walk in Ireland as part of the KM conference there recently. And knowledge management is it's sort of picked up on AI as its last hope to resurrect itself. The zombie is coming back for the fourth time. But they're making exactly the same mistakes they made in 1998, in that they're assuming that all knowledge has to be explicit for it to be real. So we took them on a walk in the Wicklow Mountains, and the Irish weather obliged. We got to the top of the hill and the rain came in horizontally with the wind. And those people who walked on a regular basis happily tripped down slippery stones without a problem. They were all in their 60s and 70s, by the way. whereas the younger people who their bodies never learned to walk in the wet were way behind. And that's knowledge which you acquire. It's the ability to sense the land ahead of you. There's all sorts of things in that process. So as I say, we got this real danger. This isn't just another tool. It's something which claims to substitute for something which tools have never claimed to substitute for before. And you can see other more minor examples. For example, I grew up with slide rules, not calculators. Slide rules, you have to be able to mentally work out what power of 10 the answer is to. So you have a sense of whether the answer is right or wrong. Whereas the calculator generation and the spreadsheet generation, if they make one error, they're not aware of the error. So this is a process we've been going through really since technology took over. And the issue is, what does it mean to remain human within that context?
Right. That's brilliantly framed. There's so much there that I want to unpack. Maybe if we could, and in lots of what I'm about to follow up with, you've already alluded to an avenue of response. So I'm really asking you to expand on particular elements. So if we could step back and I could ask you to clarify what intelligence means or how you're situating that. We spoke about, reasoning in terms of deductive, inductive, and then abductive. And then you're also pointing to implicit knowledge, and that's a helpful angle on that, in a sense, being able to recognize when one's model or framework itself is challenged, perhaps. And you pointed to aesthetics and art, an orientation, a relationship with novelty, and a capacity to actually relate beyond a particular explanatory framework, and so deal with and navigate anomalies. But I'll stop there and just say, what does intelligence mean, and what additional human capacities are we naming when we speak to the importance of art and the capacity to do abduction? Yeah.
And I think you're wrong to frame it as additional human capacities. I think what you should really saying is, what does AI mimic out of a multitude of human capacities?
Yeah.
Right, so that's a different way of phrasing it, all right? So, for example, if, the other problem is this sort of very common myth, and it goes back to a whole body. I blame Augustine and St. Paul for this, the sort of Manichaean tendency in Western thinking. The sort of mind-body-brain dualism, everything's good and evil. It's a sort of really nasty tendency that you see, right? So we know that consciousness is not just cognitive. It's not just the brain. As Andy Clark has said, a brilliant metaphor, he said, there's been this assumption the brain is an intelligent camera, and that we take in information and we process it. That's where the whole mental models and mindset nonsense comes from. Now, the reality is much more complex than that. So our bodies, as we just talked about, actually have intelligence. Part of our reasoning is done by our bodies. In fact, a large amount of it. The brain only double checks on the body reaction, not because it's directing it. That's the sort of mistake Dawkins and Susan and people like that make. They say that means we don't have free will. But that's because they're assuming a Cartesian model and assuming the brain has to make all the decisions. The reality is the body makes loads. It fires after the body made decisions, double check if it was right or wrong this time, because it may need to adjust. Also, our social environment. So we scaffold, to use again Clark's work, we scaffold consciousness into the common stories of the societies we live in and the social processes. So consciousness is extended, as he says it. It's also enacted. There's some knowledge you only have when you take action. So that's the 4 E's, which are becoming dominant, I think, in terms of understanding. And even when we read text, we do it in a different way. So I'm dyslexic. I read really quickly. To actually read a line at a time takes 3 colored pens and a lot of effort. But I can sense patterns. I'm not just taking the text literally in the way that AI does. Freeman's work showed that there are chemicals which break up the neuroreceptors of the brain, so we don't remember anything the same way twice. That creates a gradient, which is critical in biology, because without a gradient, evolution doesn't happen. AI remembers things perfectly. So there's a whole body of stuff around human consciousness, and the amount which can be limited to text processing is very, very limited. But the trouble is, if we don't use a capacity, then we lose it. No? So it's not that it's an additional capacity. We also yet don't fully understand the sensory data we take in when we make decisions. Yeah, we know that dowsing rods work. Now, it's not because there's something magic. There's some sort of sensory data which the dowsing rod is activating in human beings, which we don't fully understand yet. More recently, we started to understand the role of pheromones in decision making. Yeah, scent is a primary unit. So we have this huge, complex, messy stuff, which we're starting to understand about consciousness. We're starting to understand about intelligence. We're starting to understand that human beings behave differently in say, extended families than they do in hunting groups and they do in tribes. As part of our evolutionary history, we use our social structures to actually help us make decisions. So all of that complex, messy stuff, which is largely organic, can't be reduced to text and text processing, I think is the point. Yeah. And the problem is that because the world that we're in privileges one over the other, you've got a problem. Yeah? Because, and this was the argument I was making back in the 90s when I got into knowledge management. Everybody's forgotten about tacit knowledge. Everybody's forgotten about, for example, informal networks. We do work to generate informal networks in organizations. Informal networks act like the rhizomic mushroom roots, which connect tree roots in a forest. They redistribute resources very quickly in a crisis. But they're not explicit and not formal. So although they exist, people try and ignore them. And you get this belief that until something is, I call it the tyranny of the explicit, until something is made explicit, it's held not to exist. Right? And that's shifting towards the mechanisms of AI. It's not AI shifting towards us. AI is just doing what it could do 20 years ago, just much faster with more processing power and larger training data sets.
Why do you think the world is like that?
I think the world isn't necessarily like that. You're talking about a North Atlantic dominance of industry, right? So I think what happened if you go back to the 80s is technology became scalable for the first time. And everybody forgets it's that recent, all right? All of a sudden, technology became scalable. And then you got the sort of popular end of systems thinking, the sort of systems dynamics engineering frameworks came in with things like business process re-engineering on the hard side and learning organization on the soft side. Yeah, both engineering in their origin. Both assumed an organization could be designed. Both assumed it could be known as a whole. This fundamental error of people say we need to think holistically. They don't understand complexity science the minute they say that, because you can't and you shouldn't. You distort the system. Yeah. And therefore, what happened is it had to be made explicit. It had to be in a process. It had to be on a computer. And that drove a huge amount of productivity in the 80s and 90s. And you can see the same drive for productivity in LLM now. But nobody's thinking about the implications for society or the implications for those organizations in terms of their ability to innovate.
Yeah, right. So a couple questions here. You're saying that technology didn't become scalable until the 80s. How are you defining technology?
In information technology, let's be more precise. So, motors became scalable much earlier on than that, but the pace of changes happened. But I'd say that there's a big difference between physical augmentation, and effectively mental substitution. So we've lost a lot of physical capabilities. Yeah, I mean, when I go walking, which I try to do as often as I can, I walked yesterday, at least every month or so, I don't use GPS. So I retain my map and compass skills. And at least once a year, I do night navigation. So I navigate in dark by the feel of the land, not using maps and compasses. Because I know if I ever stop doing that, I'll lose the capacity. I'll become dependent on the GPS. Yeah. And we can see that if we look at mountain rescue callouts at the moment. We've got people who believe in Google Maps. They haven't even got the right GPS, for God's sake. And in the UK, mountain rescue is a volunteer service. It used to be like one call out a week. Now it can be 4 or 5 call outs in a day. and very stressful environments. So, losing physical capacity is one thing. Human race has done that progressively over a long period of time. It's accelerated recently, and there are issues on that, particularly being the dependence is huge on electricity. And if you look we're going to get catastrophic failures of electricity pretty soon. So that gives us a dependency problem. Yeah. We've also, to some extent, compromised the immune system through modern medicine. So child mortality rates are way below what they should be for sustainability of a species, which is not to say I want more child mortality. But I was chatting with some people who used to be in CDC before the cuts, and they said, well, if we get the next major biological plague, and we think it will be biological, then people in my age group are more likely to survive than people in your age group, because we've actually got more robust immune systems. The sudden growth in immune deficiency and failure of immune systems, part of that is not playing in the dirt and getting every childhood disease by the time you were 7. Right. So I think we need to understand that there is loss in this process, which doesn't mean there's progress. But the minute you move on to all knowledge is text and it's about text processing and synthesis and probability, then the line between fiction and fact has been blurred. Human beings are normally quite good at that, but we're losing that capacity. And effectively, you dumb us down. I think I've made this point several times, but I'll keep repeating it. Right. So it's a question of what capacities do you want to lose as a species. Now, it may well be that you'll get Latin America, Africa will start to dominate because they haven't made the same mistakes. The Chinese are actually way ahead of the Americans and Northern Europe because I think Europe's about to follow this. You have to declare your training data sets. Yeah. Now, the Americans, they're too late to do that. Yeah, because they've allowed people to go untrampled. They haven't got control of it. If you don't understand how an algorithm is trained, you can't make any judgment about whether you should trust it or not. Yeah, and the Chinese have done that. If I look at Chinese use of AI in warfare, it has more human determinants on it than American. So they've recognized that sort of balance between it. And I think that is another issue we've got, is we're allowing things to go without understanding how they work. Now, when you meet another human being, you check on their background, you get to know them, all right? There's a whole body of stuff goes on that. Pheromones, as I said, are key on trust determination. You've got ways to validate whether somebody is telling you the truth or not. You don't really have that on the internet anymore. And that, I think, that's a phase shift lost. It's not a gradual loss to which we'll accommodate, or we'll accommodate it in a bad way if we don't watch it. The good news is the electricity grids will break more frequently than people realize, and we'll have to find ways of working without them. It's also the warfare issue. It's the sort of pulse type guns which are coming out to handle drones. It's the fact if you got Russian submarines hovering over the internet cables in the Atlantic, if they get cut, what the hell happens? So we're also moving into a different type of warfare at the moment, which is quite depressing if you get to know something about it. So the ability to maintain all-rounder skills is going to be about human survival.
Yeah. So one of the key points there that you consistently are alluding to and naming is the dangers of atrophying critical capacities. I'm curious what throughout the history of culture, as part of our educational institutions, maybe kinship relations, what has been responsible for reckoning with that phenomena? As you've mentioned, we have atrophied physical capacities at different periods in history, and I massively appreciate the point about acceleration. But how do we think about addressing the predicament of atrophy in general?
I think there's several things. I think we also got into this sort of tyranny of the mean principle that sort of came in the 40s. Yeah. So let me take British education as an example. Right now, I'm not defending an academic exam at the age of 11. That was far too young. But in Britain, we split people into an academic school and a non-academic school. Now, if you then look at politics between the 40s and the 90s, politics was dominated by people who came from state schools because the bright people were focused and only 5% of the people went to university. And it was fully funded. You had no debt at the end of university. and universities were focused on pure knowledge. Yeah, and we had the polytechnic sector, which did a different type of education, which was more industry focused, work focused, etc., which took a large number of people. And there were apprentice schemes. Yeah, apprentice schemes tried to handle knowledge transfer in a very different way. And you can see this has actually continued in the army and in medical science. So you have two types of knowledge: academic knowledge, which then gets translated into practice, and practical knowledge, which then acquires theory. Doctors and nurses, officers and non-coms. That actually seems to be a very powerful combination in human history. It's those two different ways of acquiring knowledge. Yeah? But then we want everything to be the same. We destroyed neurodiversity. So the assumption is that there is a norm and you should be brought back to the norm, when actually we know neurodiversity is part of human collective intelligence. Yeah. All our polytechnics in the UK are made into universities. Right. So now everybody is going to university and we can't afford that. So now you acquire huge debt. That means that people with rich parents do better than people without rich parents, and people who go to private schools do better than people who go to state schools, because the state schools are now homogenized. Yeah, and what the irony is that the thing which is attempted to make things fairer, a system which is homogenized, has real problems. Yeah, because it lacks evolutionary capacity. And then we got into the tyranny of measurement. So this came in with the 80s, right? We're starting to come in the 70s. But it was in the 80s. So everybody got obsessed with measuring everything. And of course, the only things which can be measured in terms of outcomes are things which exist in ordered systems and are explicit. So you get in academic life, how many papers have you published? Not what's the quality of the papers you published, but how many have you published in which journals? So if you are an editor of a 5-star journal, you control your field because you can prevent people getting published, right? And nobody's got the freedom to develop. I lost a teaching job. It's a good example. It was a part-time one. It was in Marseille. So it wasn't a prestigious one, but I quite liked it because I could do the Carnac walk at the weekend because my student score went down, which I'm not used to, all right? And I asked why, and they said it was the Chinese students. And I'd set an exam, this is a master's exam, which said 20% of the mark is linked to you showing evidence you've read things that I haven't taught you. And there was a mass protest about this. Professor Snowden is asking us to be examined on things he hasn't told us what the answer is. And that just appalled me, and it appalls me to this day, all right, is that you've got this explicit tyranny of measurement. You can see the same thing in government. So they set targets for the health system, and all that explicit targets do in a complex system is they create perverse incentives to achieve the target, even if it's not the right thing. So I think what you see, and it's never one single cause. I mean, this is a complex system. What you see is a pattern starting to emerge in a dominant economic power of a focus on text, a focus on information processing, a focus on measurement, increasing starvation of resources, which means rationing has to occur, so outcome becomes a target. The games players learn to do that very well. You then get the counterculture of Thatcher, for example, that private industry can do everything better than public industry. And that has now destroyed all the rivers and the sea in the UK. And we have a catastrophe on our hand in terms of water provision, which is always going to be public, right? So what you saw is a gradual emerging pattern. And this is an assemblage, to go back to Deleuze, right? And the issue is, how can we create a line of flight from that, or how can we deterritorialize it so we can find new ways of living and working? Yeah, and that's one of the things we focus on. Yeah, but just to be clear, that you've got to avoid that being the sort of new age or new age type sort of. I get really irritated when people basically culturally appropriate indigenous thinking. Wayfinding is the latest, but there's many more. And that I am indigenous knowledge is somehow magical and mystery. I've worked with indigenous people. Their knowledge is deeply scientific. They just use a different language for it, but it's pragmatic and scientific. All right, and there's knowledge there we can acquire, but it's not mystical knowledge. Yeah, or you get what we talked about before. It's a sort of metamodern elitism, in which with that links in with adult development theory and the concept there are stages we go through, and the elite can actually save the planet. None of that's going to work. It's kind of like talking about Metacrisis gets it completely wrong. Yeah. What you've actually got to do is to change the substrate, and that's done by micro changes until the changes start to have an impact. So I work, for example, Because in engagement is using children as ethnographers at huge scale to identify what novel patterns are emerging in, not from a middle class elite sitting in Stockholm talking about how the world would be better if everybody was like them, which is what the Inner Development Goals have been doing, but seeing what's an emergent possibility in the streets of North Auckland, because that's very different from what would actually happen somewhere else.
Yeah, okay. So there's quite a few directions there, and we can only take maybe a couple at a time. I will say to those listening, Dave and I did in our last dialogue, which I recommend listening to if you're interested in the thread, some of the threads that work towards, I was inquiring about Dave's conception of mysticism, and I felt like we brought up some things which provided some interesting language around that. One of the things I'd like to pick up on is, yeah, and you also have been critical of metamodernism, as well as you just mentioned, you are critical of the frame of metacrisis. Now, I'm curious to bring back in the thread of war, because as you were mentioning in terms of drones and various other innovations in that context, there's a sense that, well, there's a reality in the jumps in paradigms of approaching warfare, which come to modulate the constraints on our security. We can have questions around whether or not various militaries are in fact effective or are likely to be effective. What does that mean for the stability of various countries? The reason I bring it in is because I'm curious about the attitudes, social conditionings, game theory that influences the way in which we are attempting to be more effective at violence, and the degree to which that constrains our capacity to influence the system, or to recognize what our lines of flight might be, as you were putting it, in order to unlock ourselves from an unhealthy territorialization. And I mention that in relation to Metacrisis, not to jump into a defense of that framing necessarily, but as I understand it, one of the core arguments for the Metacrisis as a framing is that it's looking to recognize certain commonalities of what drives and perpetuates many different problems that we are experiencing as a society. You've given an example of, for instance, measurement and our lack of capacity to recognize and value implicit knowledge, or to recognize different languages which may have pursued valuable lines of scientific inquiry in terms of the various indigenous systems of knowledge, which may be enabled because of traits and skill sets we have as human beings which haven't atrophied in those contexts, which I think is also interesting. But you have named a number of kind of deep hinges in the way we approach knowledge and interaction for the sake of understanding, which would seem to have important immediate as well as downstream consequences for how, in various echelons of society, activity is conducted, one of which may be warfare, which may be building on certain forms of knowledge which are deeply damaging to humanity and the world, but which may be effective within a certain narrow band of ultimately self-cannibalizing game theory, but still nevertheless local competitive advantage relative to one's competitor. And it seems to me that there's a place still for considering what it is about our ways of relating with each other and our modes of learning and mutual learning and the way in which we communicate, which would seem to be applicable to addressing a great many problems we encounter at other scales. And so I find from that perspective, there's value in at least that sense of metacrisis. I'm curious about the war question in particular, in order to bring that in, just as an example of a very clear case of just wildly frightening reality. And we do seem to be like, if every conversation almost isn't including in its framing that we're effectively building terminators, then in a sense we might not be including what we ought to. So I'll stop there. I'm curious what you're picking up on and what you'd like to maybe disagree with and reframe or build on.
There is a fundamental issue here, is the dominance of Northern European post-colonial Enlightenment thinking. Comes across in so many ways, right? So it comes across in the concept of inner development goals. It comes in across the concept of what I call meta-muggledom, because I refuse to... metamodernism is a really interesting movement in art. It's been corrupted by people like Hansi and the like, into something which is a quasi-religion. These things always fall back into this concept that it's an individual choice. And it's about inner change or the individual change, and that's what we need to do first. Now, that is really bad science. A lot of that also goes back to Skinner, and Skinner is at the heart of a lot of this problem. And people don't realize, and they should start to realize, behavior is an emergent property of interactions over time.
Right.
It's not got causality until it becomes habituated. And the problem at the moment is certain types of behavior and ways of thinking have become habituated. So they do now have causality. Right? So that sort of, the world will not change until everybody changes how they feel, is a very, and it's linked in with, if you look at the whole adult development life cycle, it exactly matches the myths of racial superiority that you see in colonial powers. We need to help these poor people so they can get to the same enlightenment as us. It's exactly the same trope, which is why Nora Bateson has called it out as eugenic, and I would agree with her on that. So you've got that sort of belief, and that perpetuates, right? You've also got this belief about design, is that the elite can design the future. If only the elite got together and dealt with it, and that's as bad on the left as it is with Rand and Atlas Shrugged. It's that same basic thing is there in the right and left, right, in both ways. And also the concept that we're playing chess. Now, let's go back to warfare, then I'll come back to people. Putin has been playing Go ever since he took over. He's not been playing chess. There isn't a grand strategy. What he's doing, so for example, the expulsion of conservative Jews from Belarus and Hungary destabilized Israel. That hasn't got a specific goal in mind. Funding Brexit destabilized Europe. Funding Trump, in whatever form it happened, destabilized America. What a Go player does, or Settlers of Catan, if you want another example, is they're trying to change the board and so they can exploit opportunities. And we need to realize that's where modern warfare has gone. So the bad actors understand complexity much better than the good actors. Quite fascinatingly, right? And Putin has also worked out the West wants, there's this belief that everybody ultimately is reasonable, therefore you don't retaliate fast. So if Putin moves into the Baltic states, he'll move into the Russian enclaves, which are concentrated on the border with Russia, and he'll move in before NATO can respond and then sit there. And that's what he did with the Donbass. It's what he did more dramatically with the Crimea. And everybody forgets that Putin is very driven by this concept of Rus, the restoration of historical Russia, in that sense. So he's not in the sort of Northern European, North American, Australian white concept of the way that people would act on the international stage. It's much earlier than that. The BBC did a really good story to show how the concept of a Tsar has dominated Russia since Peter the Great. And it's been inherited by Putin and everybody else, right? Now, you can go back on that and say one of the most fundamental things which caused this was actually Thatcher and Reagan being taken in by Yeltsin and not giving Gorbachev the time to create a modern state. Because Yeltsin promised to be a good capitalist and, of course, was corrupt. So it's the criminal gangs who control Russia and a lot of former Eastern Europe now, right? Now, that isn't a cause, because that came about, that's an event which we can now, with the benefit of hindsight, realize created a different dispositional state. But the danger is if you assume causality, you assume that therefore if you change people's mindsets or you change the rational side, it's not how it works. So let's take a different approach, right? So what we're looking at, and we've now proved this, but it's very easy to get 10 million, to get everybody together in a kumbaya meeting and talk about how the world would be a better place. It's very difficult to get 10 million to actually change it, right? Because change isn't that sort of demonstrable, reinforce our cultural prejudices type stuff. So what we've been doing is using children as ethnographers at scale. We've proved this in Sweden. We've proved it with Indigenous Australia. We've proved it in Colombia. We've proved it in Wales. We're now looking to scale that. So we use children to go out as ethnographers every week into their community. And that ticks a big box on the school program. Because it's community engagement, it's research, it's statistics, all of that sort of stuff is part of it. And by the way, this is working obliquely. You never, ever solve a complex problem by looking at it directly. You need to deal with it obliquely and see what emerges. I can go through Pagoda later to illustrate that. Right? So what we can then do is we can identify stories which are actually locally relevant to, say, ecological disaster at a local level. We can identify problems which are common to left and right, people who actually hate each other in social media, but at a local level agree they need to do something about this. And what we're announcing this shortly, we've been working out how we can algorithmically, this is an intelligent use of AI, allocate money to people who can assemble small teams from across silos to work on problems together, so that they don't have to apply for grants. Now that saves me a huge amount of cost in bureaucracy. Then I can see what actually works, and real investment can follow things which are working, not things where people say they can make things change. I got very cynical about people who say they've got a solution because they obviously don't understand complexity. But what we can do is change the interaction level at a very finely grained level. And then as those patterns start to reveal themselves, we can put more resources into the patterns which are beneficial and take them away from which are beneficial. Because the one thing we know with absolute certainty about a complex adaptive system is the only thing you can say which will happen is you will have unintended consequences. So major attempts to redesign society will always have negative unintended consequences. Micro changes at huge scale have some negative, but also have some positive. And the system can then change, right? So, and this is basic scientific knowledge. In a complex system, you can change the actants. These aren't just people, they can be physical things. That's why we use Latour's phrase actant, anything with any type of agency. You can change the actants, you can change their interactions, you can monitor the results. You can create some sort of scaffolding for stability. But what you really need to do is allowing energy to flow with things which start to go in the right direction, rather than things which go in the wrong direction. Now, that means you don't try and challenge the conventional orthodoxy on measurement. It's a pity we're there, but it's not going to reverse. So you offer vector measures. So if it's complex, we can actually create a measurement system, but the measure will direction and speed of travel for energy utilization, rather than predict outcome. So what I'm doing is, and this is in physics, I'm changing the substrate. And saying, we live in a world which is in a state of near disaster. I need to change the substrate so that people are interacting at hyperlocal level around things which matter to them. Because people couldn't care less about global warming and politics and war until it affects them personally. And that's part of human beings. So let's take PAGODA. This is the new acronym we produced to help people understand this. If you're managing a complex system, proximity matters. Yeah, so human beings respond to proximate threat or proximate interaction, but not to anything which is distant. And the internet distances you very quickly. There's no inhibition on it. Yeah? So then we get anomalies. If you want people to think differently, you have to create an anomaly. So what I did in Northern Ireland in the 70s, I was part of a large group, fairly junior member, but we took 2 Protestants and 1 Catholic, or 2 Catholics and 1 Protestant, and we dumped them into the slums of Rio de Janeiro. Yeah. And they learned pretty fast. They had more in common than they realized. And they had a conversation about their differences without facilitation. Yeah. So we created an anomaly which broke the prejudices, but it was a micro level and people found the solution for themselves. That's what we're trying to do at scale. Yeah. And we can put it elsewhere. We're talking about a project in California at the moment where we may, basically put the ethnographic software into schools, church groups, sports clubs. So we can measure the substrate associated with health and well-being. And in the limited resources which are now available to health services, we can deploy where it will have an impact, not where it won't. So to give you a very practical example, if you have a tight community, I can probably discharge from hospital 2 days earlier than if I live in an atomistic culture in the city. That's a huge amount of money. But what we're doing is we're generating context-specific solutions based on context-sensitive data, rather than a sort of centralized planning determination. Now, coming back to warfare, at 2 levels, and so I've been in the Ukraine and going back again this January, right? Which is an interesting trip, right? And what you actually see is Putin is playing Go. He's trying to manipulate the board and exploiting the opportunities when they come, going just as far as he can before there would be retaliation. Now, if we'd understood battlefield in complexity terms, and this is one of the areas I'm now working, we would have put we would have interdicted Ukrainian airspace the minute he threatened it. Yeah, and we wouldn't be in the position we are now if we'd done that. But people don't understand rapid intervention very quickly at the start of a pattern, because if you allow the pattern to dominate, the bad actors will generally win. But on the other side, the Ukrainians, because they've been starved of resource, have been hugely creative. To the point we have drones replacing guns. And one of the women I know, brilliant woman, is basically, she's in her 30s. She's now effectively a unit commander, having had no military experience before, because warfare is radically changing. Yeah. So I think what you're seeing, and the traditional NATO policy is to look at land, sea, air, cyber, and space. I've been arguing at several NATO conferences, we've got to take civilian into account as well. So the civilian resilience is now part of modern warfare. Yeah, and we need to measure that. Now, guess what we can do with the schools program? We can measure resilience. If we ever have to do more lockdowns, and we got a bacteriology, the invasion of Ukraine has actually delayed this, I think, because we're seeing odd deaths in Siberia, which a lot of us predicted. Because bacteria are thawing out in the Siberian tundra, for which we got no natural resistance. So there's going to be a bacterial plague sooner or later. All right. So if you've got to do a lockdown, you can't do a national lockdown anymore. That won't work after COVID. But I need to measure attitudes at a hyperlocal level so I can produce locally contextual solutions to inhibit the spread of a virus or a bug. All right. So the big thing is this context sensitivity. So to come back to the proximity, anomalies, granularity matters. You don't want big visions. That doesn't work. That just produces counter results. You don't want grand plans. That's my problem with the Metacrisis and all of those sessions. Yeah. What you want is hyperlocal interaction between people in their own environments. Yeah, and that's finely grained material. Yeah. Obliquity is key. All right. You don't try and tackle a complex problem directly. You try and tackle it indirectly, because then you'll be more open to novelty. Yeah. And then disintermediation, you need to have direct access to the raw data from the decision makers. So, for example, if I use in distributed ethnography, a politician can literally click on a graphical representation and read the stories told by the people who vote for them without them being interpreted by civil servants. Now, what I'm doing there is I'm creating that hyper interaction and that anomalous calculation between the decision maker and removing the raw interpretation of it. LLMs will actually will make that worse, not better. Yeah, and then finally you get abduction. Actually, this is an interesting example of a basically good use of LLM. So I had 7 factors I wanted to put into a word, and I've just given you 6 of them. The other one was fractal. So I asked LLM to give me a word with PAGODAF in it, and it made up some words because it likes to make me happy. So it gave me words which didn't exist and then apologized, right? And I said, drop one letter, and it came up with pagoda. And of course, pagoda is a fractal structure. So that's actually quite useful, right? And I've also used AI to compose satirical limericks on LinkedIn, right? Because that's a lot of fun, right? But the reality is that we haven't got a political level of understanding of the nature of a complex system, the nature of humans' distributed consciousness, and the nature of change. So we're stuck in this 19th century paradigm of design, change, a specific cultural version of rationality, a specific cultural version of progress. Yeah, and that's why I've been really hard on the whole meta-muggledom thing, because I think it's plain bloody dangerous. It is perpetuating an elitist model which actually was behind colonialism. And it's not allowing the hyperlocal situations to generate at scale, which is what we need.
Yeah. The substance of what you're saying in terms of proximity, anomaly, granularity, obliquity, disintermediation, abduction, and fractality, all of that's excellent. I think we are at the level of the meaning of Metacrisis. And again, it's not something I identify with, but also recognize or have resonated with and appreciated through lines of.
Talk about a polycrisis, Tim. If you talk about a polycrisis, that recognizes the same reality. But
It can do both. Like for me, I'm happy to do both. I mean,
the minute somebody puts meta in, they're implying there's some underlying causality, and that is bad science. Now, that's what meta has come to mean. Is there's an and it's interesting. It's almost Plato's cave. Is we the elite think that you guys are dancing to shadows on the cave wall because there's this underlying pattern we have to change.
No, I see that, and that is outrageous. So on that complete alignment, what I'm doing is attempting to articulate what is the basis of value that I have aligned with others in relation to that context. And I think it is to do so. One of the things I will often do is speak about the relationship between education, contribution, and belonging, where belonging is something that's continually changing, but that we are involved in tending to, adapting, remaking.
Yeah, as being as becoming. I think that's a really good way of phrasing it. Yeah.
Right. And so the all too human, and perhaps whether, I'll leave that tangent because we could consider. The question of humanity is an interesting question in terms of what we are becoming. And so I don't mean to. I think one of the questions we're all, as a culture, we're facing is what changes ought we resist and what ought we affirm? What kinds of atrophies must we accept in order to adapt to technological change, for instance? And at what point, and I don't think it would be necessarily right to frame things in terms of point, and yet one could recognize different tipping points or certain events of change which then precipitate acceleration in this way or that way. And so if we, I think my point here is that if there are reliable ways that we can, whether delude ourselves, whether do damage to the possibility for mutual learning, perhaps because of an overfixation on previous framings, and perhaps because of maybe deep-seated senses of elitism that are actually detached from appropriate valuation in the deepest possible sense, then we can participate in the degradation. We can actively engage in the atrophying of our social and interdependent capacities, which then precipitate and potentiate various crises, and the polycrisis as such to become more critical. And I would see that as a particular dynamic of what then could rightly claim to the prefix meta, but not because there's an overarching explanation that everybody needs to swallow, but that because we are in fact so self-similar in the ways we can reliably
That's what the
sabotage
language
the
has
very
come to
effort.
mean. I mean, language evolves. Yeah. So yeah, meta now means, all right, it comes back to this. There's some underlying thing based on attitude. So, we get things like imagination activism. We get metamuggledom. It's all about individual change. And I've rightly, I think, called that lotus eating. It's a way to say you're trying to change things, but actually to disengage from reality. Yeah, because you go back into a comfortable group. Now let's look at some disastrous things which are happening. Sometime in the next decade, we're going to see the first multi-million single-day heat death event. And that could be as high as 30 or 50 million on one day. Right? Now, what's that going to do to the human race? We've never experienced anything like that before. And we don't know what that is going to do to people. Right? We know physically it's going to create a refugee crisis, the like of which we've never seen before. Yeah, that's going to create a different type of warfare. Now, interestingly, I've been watching 1925, I think it is. So it's the precursor to Yellowstone, which I haven't seen yet. So I accidentally ended up watching 1925 and now doing 1893, then I'll do Yellowstone. There's some interesting stuff in a wonderful book called Not by Genes Alone, which looked at aggression levels in American males. So they studied people who had 7 generations of Texan ranching culture and 7 generations of New York City. And the experiment was to get the individual to walk towards a massive black linebacker. This is the biggest role, and to see what happened. Walk towards them. Now, what actually happened is everybody veered off before they hit. But the New Yorkers left it to the last possible minute, whereas the Southerners sort of veered off quite early and politely. Unless the linebacker insulted them first, at which point the Southerner would walk straight in, they would not give in. And that is one of the epigenetic arguments that in the Wild West, you needed an honor culture. There was no law, therefore your honor counted. And you can see that in a lot of colonial cultures and elsewhere. So you've got a system which doesn't have the rule of law, but something evolves in that, which is patriarchal / matriarchal, which is based around honor, which creates regulations within that, but it's pretty bloody violent, right? And I think those are, we need to start to think about those because those are sort of ingrained patterns, right? But as I say, I think the real thing is we've got to change the interaction level and we've got to stop pandering to populists. So, for example, one of the big mistakes the British Labour Party is making is to fall into we've got to stop all the immigrants. Now, the reality is the NHS needs immigrants desperately who are well qualified to satisfy health requirements. We should be celebrating the right sort of immigration. Yeah. But at the moment, they're playing to the popular, and this is a danger, right? There's a wonderful film by Adam Curtis. So he wrote All Looked After by Machines of Loving Grace, which is a real warning for AI. And he wrote another one, I've forgotten the name of it, about the influence of Freudianism on politics. And the point he makes in that film, which is very good, is it used to be politicians argued for what they believed in and people chose to vote for it. But what then happened is politicians started to find out what people wanted them to say so they could say it to get elected. And that's a key changing point in politics. Yeah. And the other thing which happens, you get larger and larger constituencies, so nobody knows the individual they're voting for, so the individual discrimination is lost. Now, I think that's where we've got to start looking. I mean, we're hoping to start some work on this at the Waves conference in Helsinki next month, all right? It's starting to look at what does a modern form of democracy look like, because one person, one vote, with electoral cycles of 4 to 5 years, will not solve the problems of the planet. This end of argument. And also, if somebody's prepared, like Trump is, or Oban, to actually play the game, the system doesn't survive anyway. Yeah. So again, this starts to say, well, yeah, complexity theory has come along at the right time, or anthro-complexity more specifically, rather than computational complexity, because it starts to tell us what we can change. It doesn't tell us what change is right or wrong, but it tells us what we can change. Right? Now, this is, again, my argument against the meta stuff is if we want to change the world, we've got to change small things at scale and allow different things to come through. Trying to change ourselves is an indulgence because we'll change ourselves by the results of what we do, not by trying to do that first. We got asked about face, to use a British phrase. Yeah, we're doing things in the wrong sequence. Yeah? And I think that, small-scale empathetic interactions between people, and we prove this with refugees in Malmö, the minute people see other people as humans, then things change. But they don't see other people as humans because you tell them they should. They see other people as humans because they interact with them in small scale on things that they're interested in. And that's the difference, right? And again, come back to democratic issue, and this is a big issue. In indigenous societies, the idea that everybody would have a vote is just a crazy idea because they haven't got the wisdom.
Yeah. I'm curious about your perspective on the big the big framings that we take about our economic system, and whether you see what relationships you see between capitalism and artificial intelligence, and whether or not there are dynamics of power and habituation in our economic systems which are prohibitive of the kind of granularity of interaction that you'd be advocating we support.
Okay, so let's take an example from theoretical biology, right, which also links in with Gerber's work in anthropology. And I think this is really relevant. This is work on scaffolding. I've forgotten the author, but it's in several of my articles quoted, right? We evolved, the decision groups, we did not evolve to make decisions as individuals. Humans as individual decision makers are really bad and tend to perversion if they are, right? Because they don't have the right feedback loops. I mean, you can see this, nobody around Trump can tell him what they think because they won't survive. And the nearest model to Trump, by the way, is Henry VIII, the court of Henry VIII, if you want a good example. It's very close. Yeah. Sorry. Studying, those of us who study history are forced to see other people repeat it, is the phrase, all right? Sorry, I shouldn't go down those little metaphors because I'm losing track of what I was going to say at that point. So fundamentally, all right, we've got a sexual pair, which is primary nurture. And by the way, the historical evidence is that isn't always male-female, but there is a sexual pair involved, right? Secondly, you have the hunting group or the extended family, which never has more than 5, maybe 7 at the most active members. And interesting, if you look at extended families, even in the modern day, there are never more than 5 active decision makers. So we evolved to compromise in that size of group. And where we work on intervention, we always have groups of 5 or 3 or maybe 7. And we always have one completely anonymous role, so nobody knows who it is. So that creates what's called a panopticon effect, and it keeps people honest. Yeah. But if you want to bring people together from different backgrounds, they will, in those size groups, they'll find a way to compromise. Then you get what are called deems, which are hunting parties for about 20. And they compete with other deems during summer, which is times of plenty. But in winter, where there's scarcity, they form what are called macro deems, which can be 500, 700. This is talking about Neolithic society. Yeah? And that's where monument building comes from. Because in order to get people who are fighting during the summer to cooperate, you've got to give them something to work on. So that's where monument building happens, right? Now, if you look at it, during times of plenty, capitalism works. During times of scarcity, you need to get to be a socialist. It's not a one thing or another. Yeah. And human beings learned how to cooperate, not by some kumbaya, we all common beings, we all got this, that nonsense. They learned to cooperate by doing major works and physically working together in interaction. Yeah. So I think that's one thing we need to start to look at, because resource starvation is going to be increasingly the case. But there's limits to how people can cooperate in terms of the way that you do rationing, for example, because rationing is going to come. Right? That's kind of like one factor we need to look at, in terms of that cooperation. The other thing, which I don't think we're looking at sufficiently, is gifting. So the problem is, you've got a problem with tech bros, is one is they like cybersecurity, and one is they want to write algorithms to make us more democratic. And the trouble is they're all towards the autistic end of the spectrum. So they all think it's an algorithm. Well, actually, it's much more complex than that. Yeah. So if you look at gifting cultures, a gift isn't an exchange. It's not what Larry Prusak used to call social capital. I always objected to that phrase. So I said, if I do a favor for you, I'm not accepting to reciprocate that favor. So in gifting cultures, you gift, that makes you part of the community. Your community looks after you. If you won't gift or you don't accept a gift, you're excluded. Yeah. Now, there's no theoretical reason why we shouldn't have free at the point of entry healthcare and education worldwide. The problem is we ration it with money. And so we've actually taken a capitalist model into the provision of community assets in a way we don't fully understand. And we made it, this is going back to Marxist days, control of the medium of exchange is control of everything. So it's become money, now it's crypto, right? And so if you can control that, it's no coincidence that the American right have gone into crypto big time. Because you can actually control assets without the assets having any basis in reality whatsoever. Yeah. And currency only works because people trust in it. It's no longer linked to a gold standard or anything like that. Yeah. There's a famous British television program, Survivalist, which was a sort of post-apocalyptic thing. This is 60s. And society gets resurrected because one person cons everybody else into belief that they've got underground tanks of petrol, which is the equivalent of gold. So they can issue currency based on the ability to withdraw from that petrol. And it's how you rebuild trust in that exchange mechanism. So I don't think we're doing enough to do experiments on this and see what could work. So, for example, community housing, with shared heat, shared services, and with reciprocation, would probably cost a lot less than everybody working atomistically and doing exchanges. During COVID, we saw gifting economies emerging in villages. So I think we need to start to do some experiments at a scale on what gifting would look like in a modern society. But again, there are going to be limits on the numbers on that. And I say that we need to there's a lot of work to be done to say these numbers that we know historically, which are Neolithic, what do they translate to in the modern world? Is it still about individuals or is it about identities, for example? And that's an interesting area of research.
What do you mean by identities?
Oh, so I can be professor, I can be father. I used to be a son, but no longer, right? So I have multiple identities, and dependent on context, they will dominate or not dominate. Now, in a hyper-connected societies, identities may be more important than individuals as the primary unit.
Yeah, I understand. On that point, I'm curious to bring in the meaning of religion and the place of religion and the role of religion. It has been the case that religion, in part, has functioned to cohere a sense of shared identity. Of course, there have been other modulators on how we see ourselves. You can think about nationalism and different things. I am deeply supportive of efforts to tend to, and well, it's almost, maybe it's actually like in some ways sacrilege to say this, but to nurture the cultivation of pre-existing religions, which of course is in a sense pointing to a kind of change across time or evolution, which might be totally rejected by some interpretations of those religions. That seems in part a necessity because of technological change. But also, I have doubts about the capacities of our major world religions to adapt to the changes we're experiencing. And so, on the question of identity and what can cultivate our sense of shared, valued collective identity, one of the things you're pointing to is one of the critical points you're making is I just think you can, in some top-down way, tell people they need to be more like this, and that's somehow magically going to make people, again, do what you want or kumbaya or what have you. But that to support granular, proximal, local interactions in context of shared valuation and doing together. But even in that word there, I use the word valuation. But when you give the example in Neolithic times of monument building, monument by definition points to a building of shared valuation. And perhaps you could see it as a progenitor to religious, it's kind of an activity of religious construction. Maybe you could argue that. And so at that level, there is a participation in the cultivation of a collective identity, which does seem to have something to say about who we are or how we identify. And I wonder how you think about religion in the context of multiculturalism, pluralism, and in general, our necessity to adapt to the others in the context of change and various forms of technological anomaly.
Okay, so this is a complex subject, but let's get some stuff up front, all right? There's a lot of work in evolutionary psychology which says human beings cannot avoid being religious. And it's part of what we are. It's part of what made us what we are. It creates common identity. And you can see that, for example, in Tea Party. I remember doing covert ethnography in Tea Party years ago, going back to Washington and saying, you guys have got these wrong. They're all socialists. They look after each other. They share things in common. They're centered around the church. By labeling them as far right, you're going to make them far right. So I think you see religious practices emerge, right? Also, if you look at the history, so let's look at two strands, which I do know a lot about. One is Catholicism grew by absorbing and adapting to existing native religions. That was when it was most successful, not when it tried to impose itself, but when it just assimilated like winter festivals and everything else. And the Jesuits did that in Patagonia. They almost did it in China. The Chinese emperor almost did a Constantine because the Jesuits had fused Confucianism with Catholicism based on their ability in astronomy. Yeah, because they were really good astronomers. Everybody forgets this, right? And if the Dominicans hadn't found out the Jesuits hadn't been suppressed, you'd have had a Chinese Western fusion. So that's the evolution, absorption, creation of common identity. That kind of like is a history. A lot of that in the West goes wrong with the Reformation because it makes religion not a social thing, it makes it a doctrine thing. And that's the problem. So when I was growing up, you could see people outside, the declaration I'm a convert, I'm not a cradle Catholic, so we're always more scary, right? But you'd actually see people, the men would stand outside the church and discuss what was going on in the community, whereas the women were inside at the mass and the men would go in when the bell rang and come out again. Religion was just part of the way we did things. Now with the Magdalene laundries and that, that's destroyed its credibility, right? So we're in this sort of crisis of faith, and so populism has stepped into that gap, yeah? So I think what you've got to do is trigger a different type of interaction. Now, it's not going to be by designing a religion. I think even the meta-modernists have given up on that, yeah? They got really upset. I mean, when Brandon created his new religion to attack the rapture, he had his own personal rapture in the first video. He got very upset when I pointed that out, right? because we tend to, he's come from that Protestant background. So even if he's inventing a religion, he invents it in the old form. Yeah, and inventing a religion based on Neoplatonism is scary because that's Manichaeism. If I go back into the Catholic tradition, the split between Augustine and Pelagius is where everything went wrong, if you want my opinion. Because Pelagianism was about reality and taking responsibility, whereas Augustine took the worst of St. Paul. And Calvin took the worst of Augustine, so that's a particular phrase. Religion in indigenous communities is an understanding of the world and the interactions around you. Taoism, which now everybody has got into Taoism, they're doing to Taoism what the West did to Buddhism, which is appalling. So I remember I was talking about Taoism and complexity in Singapore like 30 years ago. I remember coming back to a big conference with Peter Allen, who was then at Cranfield, myself, Matt Bagso, Eric, who wrote the book on economics and complexity. So we're all at the Judging Institute in Cambridge. Long conversation. And I said, look, what I've seen and the argument I'm making is that China is stable because of the constant interaction between Taoism and Confucianism, between something which is heuristic based and something which is rule based. And it's because they both coexist that you get stability. Now, what we've now got is all of a sudden Taoism has become the thing. It started to be linked with McGilchrist nonsense about left and right brain theory. So this underlying dualism, which you see in Augustine in Manichaeism, then comes across. So we have to have the good way and the bad way. And the bad way is always the old way, and the good way is always the new way, which I'm advocating, right? And this stuff, I think, is pernicious, right? And it's actually really dangerous because it's a different type of elitism. What we need to do is to see what is sustainable bottom up and effectively recognize that human beings working together have religious experiences, working in nature have religious experiences. It may not be the sort of form which worked in medieval times when the medieval church acted as an inhibition on kings. And that was actually one of its functions. I teach just war theory. And just war theory, you may think war was appalling, but just war theory was an inhibition. And honor codes were an inhibition on what you could actually do. We've lost that in the modern world. Yeah, so I think something new is going to emerge. But again, I'll come back to what I said at the start. Complex systems, patterns emerge because of micro-level interactions between actors at scale. And the issue is, how do you reinforce and how do you disrupt them? But you can't design it. Yeah.
No, I get you. I get you. And I agree. We are, though, having in part a conversation about design in terms of what can support enriching interactions. And you've given some things to pay attention to in that, like scale and so on, and granularity. It does seem to me, and in fact, you're pointing to this as well, that experiences, collective experiences in nature, working towards, let's say, common cause as well, in the example of the monument, that paying attention to the patterns which comprise us, sort of on reconnecting with, and I'm going to say this and just ask for a little bit of charity because I remember your frustrations here, reconnecting with our indigeneity. And you were at pains to point out, not as some, mystical thing, but in the context where we're recognizing.
I never liked charitas. I may not dissemble. Some people confuse dissembling with charity.
Just from the perspective of, it's one of those things where I'm partly trying to chart a way to voice a certain completeness of points without getting caught in a direction I don't intend. Now, in recognizing that we are in so many ways already atrophied, have lost a lot of capacities, but are capable of cultivating capacities, cultivating techniques, and also building things. In that sense, we can build technologies and design technologies which could be used to support the enrichment of the cultivation of certain kinds of skills as well. I'm interested in what supports the clarification of sharing in the process of valuation. And that's kind of what we're pointing to when we're pointing to experiences in nature and what have you. There's a sense in which what you're doing, and where I feel we're in agreement, is trying to recognize what is kind of like the most ethical and effective way those things almost sort of come together, in fact, to recontextualize ourselves around what matters and to cultivate habits in relation to doing that. And in that process, we'll see the emergence of structure, but along the way, we are in a sense also designing structures, if we could use that term, to support that process. And maybe the conversation that's had about that is a continued mediation of those two aspects, what we're designing to support encounters, and then what is revealed or discovered in those encounters. It seemed to me, and this is where our last conversation went, that there is something inherently, it feels like a kind of both a return to and an evolution of mutual participatory valuation. But that valuation could also be understood in terms of something of kind of ultimate meaning, not in, again, some top-down prescribed sense, but because it's of the essence of meaningful relationship. So,
okay.
One final thing. I'm interested in how transgressive that is with respect to present systems, and because there is a sense in which what you're saying is almost clothing itself in something that's could be seen as like not being that transgressive, because, you know, it's kind of like, I'm not saying it needs to be this thing, a radical revolution, but actually it's kind of like an attempt to actually specify what is kind of almost like of the essence of adaptation and revaluation and revivification. And that is transgressive to dominant structures. And so that's, I kind of want to bring that piece in, and whether there are particular constraints in dominant structures right up to the level of warfare that the way we use artificial intelligence could be potentiating, which are at odds with the effort to support and enrich these contexts of local contextualized interaction. Because from my perspective, it is very challenging to, well, it's possible, but just challenging to live in that context of such critically massive, powerful constraints, and also the just local humility of our interaction in the here and now.
Okay, so there's a hell of a lot in that. To point out, to take notes as you were going to make sure I cover everything we come back. So a couple of things up front. One is, I think you were made to be an anchorite.
What does that mean? I don't know what that word means.
Anchorites used to sit on pillars in the desert and commune with God. All right, so look up at it.
Oh, no.
If you actually look in religious times, different groups had different functions. So you had teaching orders, contemplative orders, you had hermits. We didn't have a one-size-fits-all type of spirituality. And also, just as a side line, I mean, Vatican II, which is the famous aggiornamento in the Catholic Church, refocused on peace and justice, tick in the box, but made the fundamental mistake of getting rid of the Latin Mass and ritual. Yeah, because actually ritual is important. What matters in Catholicism is the ritual, not the words. Right? And remember, the big Catholic Protestant divide is justification by faith alone. soli fide in Protestantism. Whereas in Catholicism, you have to do good works as well. So that's a minor issue. But fundamentally, coming back to this, right? I think the design question is an important one. So it's human beings, and this is why we're now talking about way shaping, not way finding. Right? Because human beings shape their own ways. They don't just discover some hidden mystical truth, by giving up on themselves. Sort of surrender concept behind the psychological approaches to complexity I get really nervous about. So we make paths, so we can design things. So the science tells us what we can design. We can design interactions, we can design scaffolding, we can design interactions, we can design monitors. What we can't do is design outcomes, because that will go wrong. Yep. So this is where we work with, for example, S-tram mapping. We just completed the final framework, which is called Weaving Risk, Strategy and Innovation Together. We're still playing with the name on it, which is about combining grand strategy with tactics in the same time frame. The big work which we just launched, which I'll send you the stuff on, is mimicking bee swarming behavior. Because if you look at insect behavior, they always optimize by not having a directed intelligence. And indigenous hunting groups do a thing called the levy walk, which is the same thing that basking sharks do, in order to optimize food discovery under conditions of uncertainty. So the insect models optimized by micro-interaction. So what we're now doing, and we want to do this at a state level, is we're not trying to get people to vote explicitly for what they want. That's the mistake the tech bros are making. What you need to understand for political decision makers is what are the attitudes and what's sustainable. So we can present a situation to as many people as you want. They can interpret that situation in ways where they don't know what the interpretation means. We're using abstract words and symbols, because we're looking for patterns. I can then look at the patterns of how people assess the situation, what they think will happen next, what they would like to happen, how they would see that happening. That's Horizon 3. I can then look at patterns in that, and then I can take one pattern and represent it to people who created another pattern. And I can go through presentation and representation till I can see what consensus is sustainable. And I can find the outlier groups who are seeing the world very differently. Now, you see what I'm doing there in design terms? I'm putting something in place which reveals what patterns are sustainable. I'm not trying to decide in advance what patterns should exist. And we're about to launch that for companies and organizations, and said that's about to come out. I can send you the stuff on that. Now that's come out of 6 or 7 years of theoretical study and a lot of practical experiments. What we haven't done is design something abstractly. We take a physics model. You start with the maths. Once the maths looks beautiful, you move to experimental. That modifies the practice, and then you hand over to engineering. So that's kind of like our general approach. Now, what we're doing there is we're basically we're making the substrate reveal to politicians what's feasible and what isn't feasible, and where you can go next. And we're also, one of the problems we got in the States is woke went too far, which gave the angle for the right to come in, and they picked on the extreme examples and made those big, so damaged a lot of stuff in the process. And so taking people too far too quickly in the direction you choose to prefer nearly always comes back on you and creates the opposite of what you want, which is, Gilead is coming in the States, if you look at it in that sense, right? So this first thing about understanding the territory and understanding what's feasible and not feasible, and then starting to change things and see what the results are before you commit. But that needs to be at scale, and it needs to be bottom-up generated. So that's kind of like a key issue on that. All right, so that's the type of way we design. It also links on, the wider issue, the whole issue about boundaries. All right, so the danger is, and this is a big problem. This is one of the big differences between complexity science and systems thinking. Is systems thinking defines things by boundaries. And it also comes from Ashby's theories of information. And Ashby was talking about information in machines, which is limited, right? But the problem you've got is that in a complex system, you may not have boundaries. So if I look at safety, for example, then the way safety rules are worked out is people retrospectively study what they think happened, and they believe what they're told. That's mistake number one. Then they assume that future incidences will follow the pattern of the past incidences. but the results will follow a Gaussian distribution, i.e. a bell curve. Now, reality sits in the tails of a Pareto distribution, the famous fat tail. So we've done a lot of work which has shown that the cause of mental breakdown in blue light services is due to the rules, safety rules, not the practice. And you can see the industrialization of behavior. So, for example, the whole psychological safety movement is now a massive power grab, which basically destroys dissent. So it homogenizes the system, and that's actually quite dangerous. All right, there's a lot of examples like that. So if we take that Gaussian Pareto, that's the same thing as the order complex divide. So in an ordered system, you can design for outcome. Nothing wrong with that, set outcome-based targets. In a complex system, you can't work out in advance what the right thing is to do. But human beings, and this goes back to Aristotle and virtue ethics, which I think we need to go back to. If people have the right training, the right background, and the experiences, you can more or less trust them to make the right decision. That links in with honor code that I talked about earlier as well. Yeah? So what we're doing is to say, well, look, we know that people in groups, let's take a group of 5. Yeah, so this is the latest thing coming out of the RAS framework. So if you agree within your community to assemble 4 roles, and the roles are designed, and this is designing the substrate, right? The roles are designed to get people who would not normally talk to each other to work together on something. So if you can assemble a group of 4 people, you agree to accept a 5th person who's completely anonymous, so you never know who it is. It might be a committee, it might be AI, it might be an individual. And you do narrative recording of the context, the decision, and the consequence. You can spend $1,000, $20,000, $1 million, that depends on the organization, what it's doing, without applying for permission to the board or to the government. Right? Now that's completely auditable. I can have 100 of those going, provided 1 succeeds, that's all I need, 99 can fail. But what I'm seeing is what can emerge bottom up from the system before I commit my resources. I'm not trying to work out in advance what the right solution is. Now, again, that's an example of the work we're doing, is to design how the system can be, and I'll use the word manipulated. I think we need to be honest. You're trying to manipulate things. If you use dishonest words, you don't get anywhere. But we know we can't manipulate by outcome, but we can manipulate, as any parent knows, who your children's friends are. And who they interact with and when they interact with them. And I still remember in the 20s, all right, and this was foundational for me. So I was on the program to combat racism on the student wing of the World Council of Churches. And one of the first Catholics there, they took me on the tour of the Park of the Reformation and didn't realize how much of an insult it was. So I worked on Indigenous land rights in Northern Australia, and that's one of my formative experiences because one of the Indigenous activists had his head blown off by a shotgun next to me by a mine security guard, and I went to the police and they said it's only an abo, and they wouldn't listen. Right? And then I was working on auditing the refugee camps in Zimbabwe and also in the slums of Rio and elsewhere, right? And I think that radically changed me in a way that I couldn't be complacent anymore, right? So let me give you an example of a design. So you come back from that, you can't see the world from a particular cultural perspective anymore, and you know people, right, in that sense. So one of the things I proposed in the UK ages ago is, and this was the Labour Party, that we should reinstate national service, right? Which I said, this will throw the Conservatives completely because they wouldn't expect the Labour Party to do this. And you can do it in the army because we need people trained because war is coming in Europe. That was predictable I was predictable when the wall fell and the way that the West handled it. You could absolutely predict that war was coming, right? So we need people trained, but also people can choose to work overseas for 2 years. And if you do national service, we pay your university fees and we give you a grant. If you don't want to do it, you pay full rates and you cover yourself. And we'll have some exceptions for maths and physics because that requires very young people. And I said, what this will do is it means people will go to university with mature experiences, so they're more likely to learn more. But secondly, we won't get little Englanders anymore because a sizable portion of the population will be exposed to different cultures in difficult situations and they'll be changed by it. And I would still argue for that sort of thing. Now, you see what I'm doing here is I'm designing the interactions, but I'm also, and this is a science, getting those interactions happen before brain plasticity locks down to cultural norms, which it does at early 20s female, late 20s male. So again, this is Yeah, this is ecosystem design or substrate design. It's not outcome or engineering design. And the problem, this comes back to where we started. AI is an engineering solution, not an ecological solution. And engineers have a part to play, but they're not the totality of it. Yeah. So again, it's using technology in the right way, not the wrong way, to link and connect.
So,
oh, by the way, so something else I remember, you've seen the growth of extreme sports? Well,
that makes sense
it's
to
quite
me.
interesting. Human beings, and it was a point made very well in 1925, and I'd been making it before I watched that, is one of the reasons for the growth of extreme sports is society isn't risky enough. So we could have explored space a lot earlier if we were prepared to accept that 30% of astronauts would have died, and there would have been plenty of people who wanted to be astronauts. And so things, the diversity of the human experience, and again, this argues against the sort of the norm that you see, the norming around psychological safety, the whole meta-modern thing about attitudes and vertical development. This is an attempt to actually to homogenize the society based around a particular concept. Whereas actually, the ability to handle homogeneity is what's key for humans.
So you also have, sort of contrasted with that, you have the attitude toward risk that's typified in move fast and break things. And so in the tech sector, you have an attitude toward risk there that they might dress up in a sense of outcome that they might naively believe is, benign. But there is in practice very risky
Well, yes and no.
behavior.
I don't see many people because you've got a culture come up now. I mean, at the moment, everybody is, I'm talking with VCs at the moment. Yeah. And they're actually fairly risk averse. They got more money they can't invest, but they're trying to invest in something which will be bought by Google or Apple, not in something which will be the next Apple or Google. So the tech sector has become actually quite risk averse. It's very difficult to get things wrong if you've got technical skills. If you get them wrong, you'll get another job the next day. There's no real heightened risk in that, right? And the physicality of the risk is different.
Well, maybe not how they think about their own achievement, but in terms of the risk they're willing to externalize to society by.
Oh yeah, I buy that. And I mean, it's the sort of principle we should all, I said this the other day, that what the tech sector is preaching is that they're utopians, but they don't know what the utopia is, and we're just expected to trust them. Right? And that's actually quite scary if you think about it. But having said that, again, I'll come back to, one of the things we're doing, say, with the citizen engagement program, and I've just talked about, which is called Swarm Compass. So how do you use swarm intelligence to get a sense of direction? Part of its function is to create better training data sets. So except AI is there, but what it's trained on really matters. And the problem you've got, there was a book I saw last time I was in the MIT bookshop, which is my favorite bookshop in the known planet, all right? They give me free bags every time I go there, but as my wife pointed out, the amount of money I've spent to go in those 3 bags means they should be free anyway, right? But there was a book I refused to buy. It was headed Correlation is Causation. And that's a tech pro concept. They're getting enough data, enough algorithms. And one of the reasons is because they're at the autistic end of the spectrum, they really don't like human interaction very much. So one of the things I'm looking at in design sprints, for example, and architecture is how do you create more neurodiversity in tech development? And the irony is AI may make that easier. Yeah, because it may take away some of the stuff which rewards the sort of Asperger's autistic end of the spectrum because it can do that really well. And it may actually give more space for people from other backgrounds who can actually do better design. Yeah. And by the way, you see the same on IT. The really successful IT programs are not software. It's software which accepted, not software which was developed for a purpose. Yeah, the internet was accidental. Twitter was accidental. LinkedIn was accidental. Yeah, what actually happens is it's the ability to exploit unexpected consequences, which is key. And you need to design systems to do that. So if I take an applicant interaction design, so when we had the patient record system in the UK, which was the largest ever disaster in IT government procurement worldwide, right? It was massive. They tried to design the whole system. I was in IBM then. We tried to get IBM to put in a non-compliant bid. And we said, if we look at the actants in the system, it's doctors, hospitals, nurses, ambulance. The primary interaction is to read and write to a patient record. So let's not design the whole system. Let the patient carry the record with them on an implanted chip, a credit card, or in paper. And then we'll invest in readers that can read and write to that chip from the hospital or the doctor system, when we can progressively roll something out and see what happens. Then we'll further codify what works. We're now saying that in a software design, an object in software terms can be a people object. It can be a crew with a defined input-output, and that can handle ambiguity. And we wait to see how a human team manages stuff, because in the tail of a Pareto distribution, human beings in different combinations can make decisions where you can't have rules in advance. That was my point about the Pareto curve. So we're now starting to look at how do you architect systems for emergence rather than trying to design them for outcome.
Yes. So there's two questions I'd love to ask before we run out of time. One is to do with lines of flight and directionality. Maybe we can end with that. I say it just to include it in the memory of the space. And the first is, and I could be quite off here, have I seen you say that the perception of complexity, or the perception of a complex system, can become, with understanding, ordered for one perceiver and remain complex for another?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, I'm interested about the dynamics of, asymmetric gaming or manipulation of complex systems. A lot of this conversation has been almost treating the epistemics of our practical action as if we were all kind of on board, in a sense, and sharing the same set of perceptions, or at least have some sort of alignment. But of course, in the context of war and economic competition and different things, and massive asymmetries of power in terms of algorithms, and I think the techno-feudal context we live in, it would seem to be the case that powerful actors can modulate systems with far more predictability of next outcome than others. And so I'm curious about that as a dynamic, basically, and whether you and how we.
Okay, so first of all, remember what I said,
but
Putin is playing Go, not chess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what the powerful actors do is they manipulate the environment and exploit the opportunities. They don't have a plan per se. That's a mistake, all right? You can apply that retrospectively, but you manipulate the environment, you exploit the opportunity. Right? And the whole point about the perception issue, the irony on this is that Ralph Stacey, who hated systems thinking, made the same error that systems thinkers make in assuming the nature of the system is defined by people's perception. So what Cynefin says, and we're new materialists, remember, is say, reality exists. Some systems are complex, some are not complex. Knowledge exists, and sometimes we know systems in the wrong way, sometimes we know them in the right way, and perception is the same. So the key thing is to increase the friction between reality, knowledge, and perception, because they'll always be misaligned, but the more you have friction, the more they're likely to align. Yeah. And there are also norms in the way society works. So up until the 50s, we all trusted experts, and that didn't work. So now we're trying populists for a change. So there are patterns of what I call regularities which emerge. And the key thing about complexity, and this is what happens with behavior, is a regularity of behavior becomes a habit, and then it has causal properties. Right? And they're difficult to disrupt. So lines of flight, to go back to Deleuze and Guattari, is one way. The other way, which we focused on, is they say basically an assemblage territorializes space. So we focused on deterritorialization. So, for example, with S-Rime maps, we identify the actants and we position them on a grid between energy cost of change and time to change. but no disagreement is allowed. If you disagree, you break it down until you agree. So we deterritorialize by making the thing more finely grained, then it can reassemble. What we're doing with the children ethnographers is to identify the street stories and understand patterns in the street stories before you start to look at the dominant narrative patterns of society. So granularity deterritorializes and allows new patterns. That's also a key principle of complexity. Complex system scales by decomposition and recombination, not by imitation. Yeah. So the key thing in using technology, for example, to support new forms of democracy is to allow smaller things to interact in different ways, but actually have feedback loops so you can see beneficial and non-beneficial results. It's not about designing an outcome, and it's not about being explicit. All right. So you look at some of the democratic movements. Well, you assign your vote to somebody you think is an expert. That is a classic Enlightenment rationality approach. That's not going to work. Yeah, anything explicit will be gained. Right? You make things explicit, the more they can be gained by bad actors. The more you make them implicit, the more difficult it is for bad actors to manipulate.
Yeah, I find that to be a constantly interesting thing to relate with, because it does seem to me we can model and to some degree make explicit at different levels, and that matters, the nature of the process we are engaging with, and that process can very much be one of the decomposition into recomposition. And so in that sense, a certain modeling of transformation, and that seems to be necessary to me. I personally want to see more. What that shows up like is, again,
You can't
like
model
mutual
model a
learning.
complex system. That's the problem. Because you can't know, a model assumes you know the variables. You can
Modeling
simulate.
in that way. I don't mean modeling in that way. I mean more modeling like how a child, might see their father behave or something like that.
Okay, so that's imitation, which is common, but it only happens in certain age groups, all right? Apprentice models, for example, induce failure quite early on in the cycle. Yeah, and if you look at apprentice models, it was a journeyman who taught, not the masters. So but the point is that's an ecosystem which evolved, which we somewhat damaged. So you've got to recreate ecosystems, yeah, which actually manage knowledge transfer in different ways. And again, that's designing the interactions.
But again, I feel like we can distinguish between modeling as imitation and then modeling as what would look like inspiring a certain kind of
Yeah, but that's NLP,
virtue
right?
in relation to the cultivation of skills at that adaptive proximal level.
But remember, there are the histories about this concept, all right? So one of the things which NLP did, which is an established pseudoscience, yeah, is it basically said people model great people, therefore I can create things that you then model.
That's the exact wrong way, for sure. So I am for sure meeting you in the strong criticism of that, massively so. The way I'll often.
So to talk about changing interactions, don't talk about modeling, because actually it's not so much the child is modeling the parent, it's they're modeling the interactions between them and the parent. And it's far more than imitating behavior. There's also other forms of communication going on there. So family groups, extended family groups, give children more models, if you want to use your language, than single atomistic family groups.
Totally.
Yeah?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
Communal living is starting to come back now. That's actually good news, all right, because we evolved for it. And the irony is that's actually a side effect of the ridiculous cost of housing, that people are being forced to buy houses in common. And ironically, that is actually quite a good thing. Yeah.
In estuarine mapping, or at least in the day I attended where you spoke about estuarine mapping, I think I might be getting the category wrong here. One of the modulators, might not be a modulator, it might be, was transformation by contagion.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, it seems to me that that couldn't mean transformation by mimicking. There's a sense in which something which passes as a contagion is a kind of mimicking, just a
Well,
re-representation.
there's catalyst and there's contagion. The point is the constructor, which is what you're talking about, doesn't change. So, for example, if a 3-star general walks into a discussion on military policy, the conversation will change the minute they arrive. That's contagion. They don't want it to change. They don't even notice the change, but their presence changes things. So,
Right.
and catalysts. So, if you get a mad ant into a family group, it's a catalyst. The mad ant doesn't change, but it changes the family dynamics.
Right. But couldn't there be, but couldn't part of that be it's not modeling as like,
It's habits. Think about habits. We pick up habits from our parents.
but yes, but it's also an invitation to a certain kind of interaction, an invitation to a certain kind of relationship. So I think we can learn what it is to interact in the context of uncertainty or anomaly.
It is, all right. So if you don't get certain types of nurture by the time you're 2 or 3, parts of your brain never develop to the point, for example, you won't be able to fly an airplane because you won't have the right sort of balance. You don't see racism in kids until you hit puberty, but then it starts to lock down after puberty. So there are times. So it's why that sort of care period up to 2 or 3 is so critical, because of where so many things are formed. All right.
Yeah.
So I think an awareness of that is important, but it's also a diversity. So we don't work, for example, on archetypes. Kids find 5 times as many archetypes as adults because they see the world in more diverse ways. So when I was growing up, often nobody knew where we were sleeping that night because we were moving around between aunts and uncles and families and sleeping on floors and God knows what else, all right? And the atomistic family, that's going to tend to perversion because you don't have enough diversity of interaction.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, we only have a couple minutes, so there's something. It's kind of curious to me. There's a way of like it's coming up with the way we're relating with the words modeling and meta. It's for me. I'm just trying to get at the meaning, and I sense that we actually share a lot of the meaning in common. But you have more of a investment in the particular definitions as they relate to formalisms in the actual work you're doing. And so I think we've kind of made it through a bunch of those, but it is kind of curious because I also sense that there's still part of this underlying basis that I'm wanting to bring more and more, like unearth a little bit more and more. I feel it's there. We're obviously running out of time now. In the context of lines of flight and directionality, why this way rather than that way? Obviously, I suppose I'm asking that I am fully accepting and in agreement with what you're saying about
That's why I prefer deterritorialization, because more choices become apparent.
Yes, but you're beautiful. Why care about? I mean, so I agree with you, but then there's what is it in us? What is it in being as such? What is it in reality that can, like, why a firm choice? Why care about
Because we're a social species and choice has consequences.
Of course, but it's because we also care about.
I've got a granddaughter of 2 now. I want the world to be survivable for her. Yeah,
right, but more than survivable.
Don't underestimate the power of empathy in human evolution.
Oh, of course, totally. I'm not for a moment. Like I'm with you. Do you know what I mean? Like I care about understanding what you have to say because it really matters.
But the point is, empathy doesn't come because you decide what it should look like. I'll keep going back to this.
Of course. Do you think I'm arguing that for that? Because I don't think you do think I'm arguing for that. But that's obviously something you're reiterating.
You keep coming back to the language of inner self. Now, I don't think you may not intend it, but you keep coming back to it.
Really? I don't think I am. I think I'm coming back to what it is to participate in interaction, and what
Right.
it is to sense in relationship, what it is to mutually navigate valuation. But what
And
I
the other
am
thing I
saying
think
is
which
that
is key,
our
but
orientation touches on something of fundamentality by virtue of that. It is shared and it's evolving.
But it's who you're talking to, all right? So one of the key principles of complexity is you start from where people are, not where you would like them to be. And
Agreed.
that's really difficult for people to get. So in a modern society, if I say I can use my school children as a sensor network and discover patterns which will save me money and reduce my risk as a politician, I might get somewhere. And I think the issue is, how do we communicate the science in ways that people in current positions of power see will do something with it? Now, the minute you go into the sort of language we've been talking about, you just get put in a bucket. Right? And that's a bucket which can gain money and can get, but that's my lotus eating point. Right? The reality is we have to find ways with engaging with power with where it is, and then let the system actually handle the change.
Yes, well, that's awesome. I wish, that sounds like an awesome place to begin another conversation. It's so curious the ways that we are perceived. But so it is. That was awesome, Dave. I'm so grateful for your time. I look forward to the next time, and I would love to invite you into conversation with others. You did call out quite a few people there who I would like to get. I'd be very. Yeah, there's very interesting interactions that could occur. Challenging to realize.
Oh, yeah. So some are refused. One of my experiences, a lot of people who are trying to become gurus do not want to engage with people who might challenge their guru status.
Well, there you go. Well, I have experienced that myself for sure. In terms of, it's funny. We share that in common.
And Tim Logan says, I've got to stop trying to confuse you. Yeah.
You got to stop trying to confuse
Tim
me.
Logan says, I've got to stop trying to confuse you. So he said that with a smile in his face. All right. But
yeah, well, confusion's good, it's just if we can stay with each other in the process, and unfortunately
it's apparatic, it's not confused.
Right. And then there's a trust and an intimacy and a whole bunch of stuff which can, if it's not present, then we fall from the aporia into the confusion, and the interaction stops, and it's a big issue, and it's very, very challenging, and you're beginning from places where you're being perceived in all manner of ways which may only be half true, and in sometimes are just mostly false. It's difficult. There's a question of authority here, which is really interesting. I would love to touch on. I'll just note that when you mentioned the Jesuits in China in relation to the emperor, it seemed like there was a particular instance in which if a certain dynamic of authority had been navigated this way or that way, it could have perpetuated very large-scale changes. And that, I think, it approaches some of this conversation from another angle, and I find that confusing but interesting as well. So, all right, I'll let you go, Dave. Thank you so much.